It's the story of the upstarts and underdogs who toppled John D. Rockefeller's seemingly unbeatable oil monopoly at the turn of the century. As I was thinking about how to tell the story, it really struck me that, wait a minute, here we have a situation where the world was going from coal to oil, and all of the processes and market events that were making that transition happen. And a lot of that's been covered, but one of the cool angles of this, and the thing that I find enduring and interesting about oil, are the people who actually made these transitions happen, the people who were involved. And so when I started digging in and scratching around, I realized that we actually had some amazing characters and real life, larger than life individuals that the world has largely forgotten. Yet these were the people who actually made the global energy world that we've enjoyed and suffered from and yelled about for over 125 years. And the other interesting part about this is Rockefeller himself. The memory we have, our shared collective memory of the world's richest man, is oftentimes framed around Rockefeller as a very old man. So oftentimes we think about Rockefeller as the grandfatherly figure who was really wealthy, and he would hand out dimes and lead people in song on the golf course. But that was Rockefeller when he was in full public relations mode. He had learned a very powerful lesson about pissing off the media, ignoring the media, and not engaging in the media. And so the media turned on him. And so sometime around the late teens, Rockefeller embraced the media. And he actually learned how to play the media game, in many ways, better than the journalists who were covering him. They didn't understand that they were being played. So I suddenly realized that many of us have an entirely false memory of Rockefeller as that grandfatherly figure in our popular imaginations. And so what I wanted to do was go back. I wanted to roll the tape back to 1889, which is this moment where Rockefeller was at the peak of his power. And here he was, the largest, I guess you could say, majority owner of the world's largest oil company. In 1889, Rockefeller controlled 80% of all the oil on planet Earth. Now stop for a minute and think about in today's age. Now, granted, things have changed, but think about in today's time and age, if there was an individual who single-handedly controlled 80% of the planet's oil, that was Rockefeller. The other cool part about Rockefeller is that he never played fair. Rockefeller had actually created this globe-spanning monopoly by crushing and destroying his competitors, and he did so through many underhanded means. So whether he was creating an artificial shortage of oil barrels in Cleveland, Ohio, or cutting secret deals with the railroads, plots and schemes always abounded at Standard Oil. And slowly, this for us or against us mentality emerged in the corporate culture of Rockefeller's company. And it became so ingrained in the way everyone at Standard saw the world that they actually started defining the world in terms of literal war and peace. So all the companies that Standard Oil had destroyed or absorbed into the empire were literally considered at peace with the monopoly. All of those independents who still resisted Rockefeller's domain were deemed at war. And so by 1889, Rockefeller embodied the definition of the old saying that the Roman Empire makes a desert and calls it peace, because there was no competition left in America, except in East London. And so at that exact moment, in the same neighborhood where Jack the Ripper the previous year, I'm reading this, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Jack the Ripper the previous year was stalking and killing his victims. In this exact same neighborhood of Houndsditch was this little known, somewhat obscure Jewish merchant named Marcus Samuel Jr. And Marcus Samuel Jr. had the offer of a lifetime standing in front of him. And it turned out that the Rothschild family, the world's bankers, had a problem. John D. Rockefeller was blocking them. They had all this Russian oil and they couldn't get rid of it. And because Rockefeller had absorbed them and forced them to play by his rules. He had allocated a small section of the European market and they couldn't get away from him. They couldn't break his monopoly. And so this little-known Jewish merchant named Marcus Samuel Jr. Embarked on a journey that would change his entire life. And it brought him all the way east to the oil fields of Russia, and he's standing on the docks of the Black Sea. And it is that moment that something really cool occurred in history. And we know this because this part of his story is actually documented. He's standing on the corner, on the docks at Batumi, and he's watching case oil, kerosene packed in cases into a ship. And he understood markets, he understood problems. He was really good at figuring out how to solve a commercial problem. And in that moment, something clicked, and something eternal clicked in his mind. Because the same problem set that he was looking at, problems of distance. Oil is never where it needs to be. Where the oil wells are is not where the consumers are. Problems of geography, getting it through geographic choke points and past persistent conflict zones. Problems of technology, problems of commercial risk, and most importantly, problems of greed. This is an eternal problem set, the exact same problem that Marcus Samuel glimpsed at the docks of Batumi in 1891 is exactly the same problem set that any oil company in the world today still has to overcome. Distance, geography, risk, technology, and greed. And so at that moment, Marcus had a flash of inspiration, and he realized that all the oil companies in Russia were doing it wrong. They were packing their product in cases, and he realized, I'll go in bulk. I'll actually put my oil in a tanker, and I will sail it through the previously opened Suez Canal. The only problem was, at the time, technology had yet to arrive, because oil tankers at the time were essentially these giant weapons of mass destruction. They were huge floating bombs. In fact, I found somebody, a maritime engineer author at the time, was writing about how it was actually, you almost had to gang press people in order to, sailors, in order to man these early oil tankers, because they were suicide machines. They would blow up and kill everyone on board, and the technology had not arrived. So Marcus found a way to navigate this problem. And what he ended up doing was creating the world's first truly modern oil tanker, which sounds kind of boring until you realize that our entire human civilization today relies on this exact same technology. Moving oil distance across long distances, through geographic choke points, over navigating new technologies, overcoming risk. And this was the problem set that Marcus ultimately solved. And his enemy, though, his enemy was no pushover. His enemy had destroyed absolutely every single other oil man who had tried to go up against him. And that was John D. Rockefeller. So that's why I thought this story was compelling, because at the heart of this, we have the best David and Goliath story of the 20th century. We've got a small-time, nimble entrepreneur going up against the most mighty industrialist of his era. And the small-time guy is smarter, he's more faster, and he figures out how to beat John D. Rockefeller at his own game, how to use the exact same tactics against Rockefeller, but do it on a larger scale that no one had ever conceived of. And what he would do is he would take Rockefeller's trick of using economies of scale, of cutting to kill the competition with price cuts, of lowering a price in one market to undercut your competitor while raising it in another. And Marcus's solution to this problem was to go really big and go global. So what he did was he decided, I'm going to turn all of Asia into my battlefield. So Rockefeller has always been used to having someone compete with him in a single market or a single country. I'm going to compete with Rockefeller simultaneously across all of Asia. So in overcoming this 5-part problem set of distance, geography, risk, technology, and greed, of harnessing these new developments, of moving oil for the very first time through the Suez Canal, Marcus Samuel was able to actually defeat a man who had never yet been defeated. And in the process, though, he made some enemies. Because just as Marcus is ready to grasp his big coup, he's done it, he's now in Asia, there's a competitor. There's another upstart, another rival on the periphery of the Dutch colonial world in Sumatra, and they too have figured this out, except they have an advantage that no one else has. And their advantage is that they're already in Asia. And this was a company that we know today as Royal Dutch. Marcus's company we know today as Shell Oil. And what they did was initially they tried to get along, but then the leader of Royal Dutch was a guy named Henri Detterding. He was this hard-charging, take-no-prisoners Dutch oil man. And Detterding and Samuel did not get along. Their egos were just too big for the same company. So what we have now is a story. Ultimately, this is what Breaking Rockefeller is all about. It's a story about big oil, bigger egos, and this bare-knuckle fight against the world's most dangerous oil men. One thing I really liked about Marcus Samuel and sort of exploring his life and getting to know who this guy was that I can actually understand where he was coming from. Here we have an individual with no experience in the oil industry, a talent for solving these problems, an understanding of Asia, and most compellingly for me was this impediment that really only affected Marcus, but it affected many others, and that was the latent barriers of anti-Semitism in late Victorian England. So Marcus was part of the new breed of individual. At the exact same moment that the British aristocracy was entering terminal decline, when the old era of landed money and wealth based on rented land was dwindling, there were these new upstarts surging into the British aristocracy. And they had a problem, though. They could afford the lifestyle of the aristocracy because they were richer than anyone, thanks to their industrial prowess, but they had the wrong education. They weren't trained in the subtle rules of the British aristocracy. They didn't speak with the right accent when they talked, and that was Marcus's problem. Whenever the aristocrats looked at a guy like Marcus, they immediately discounted him. And worse than that, though, anti-Semitism wasn't only pervasive at the time in this part of England, but in Victorian England, but for many in the aristocracy, it was actually quite fashionable to be anti-Semitic. And so Marcus was very sensitive to his status in this society, and he wanted to rise. He wanted to actually break into the upper echelon of the English aristocratic circles, but he didn't have any way to do that until oil. So here you have a guy who wants to swing for the rafters, essentially, and yet the only way he could achieve that launch into the aristocracy was to become richer than anyone, because at the time, sure, anti-Semitism was a problem, but there was nothing more popular than being fantastically wealthy. If you could attain a certain level of wealth, if you could be as rich as the Rothschilds, then everyone would have you at their parties. Then you could enter into that higher echelon of the British aristocracy. That was what was really ultimately driving Marcus, and it set him completely apart from his rival, his enemy, John D. Rockefeller. Because for Rockefeller, money was the ends and the means. It was simply a measure of gathering as much wealth as possible. Rockefeller really didn't care for money aside. It was like money for the sake of money for Rockefeller. But for Samuel, money could purchase something that he couldn't get it could purchase him acceptance and, more importantly, status. So that really drove him. Except the problem is that at the moment the book starts, Marcus is failing. Marcus hasn't achieved nearly enough wealth. He hasn't achieved nearly enough success in Asia, and so he latches on. After being initially suspicious, he latches on to this idea of oil. And so what drives him from being essentially a mediocre nobody, by the end of his life, Marcus ends up as the Viscount Beerstead. He essentially is one of the most highest ranking nobles in all of England. Better yet, he's also one of the richest because of his oil wealth. So I found that this collision of ambition and anti-Semitism and market forces and the changing world as it was going from coal to oil, I found this to be a story that absolutely had to be told. And I started scratching around, and I realized the last book written on Marcus was in 1960. It was a biography by his son-in-law, and it wasn't very good. So I decided that this is a story that I really wanted to tell. So what But it had been told in certain ways. For example, Daniel Jurgen had sketched it out in his epic book, The Prize, which is sometimes daunting, very dense, very rich in facts. But in every time this story is told, and where it had been told over the past century, the relationship was opposite. Because Samuel and his rival Detterding, they were always paired together, but it was always Detterding who was the hero. And Samuel was always the underling. Samuel was always the, oh yes, and then there was Samuel. And I thought this was weird, because here we have a guy who was the first to construct the modern oil tanker, the first to cross the Suez with bulk petroleum, which nobody had done before, not even John D. Rockefeller, the first to crack the Standard Oil monopoly in Asia, and the first to succeed against all of these incredible odds. But when you look at every previous history that had ever been done on this story, Detterding, his rival, always got the marquee. Samuel was always the follow-along. So I thought to myself, wait a minute, why don't we do this? Why don't we tell Hamlet, but do it from Horatio's point of view? Let's revisit Don Quixote, but look at Sancho Panza as the real hero of this story. And that's the doorway, that's the avenue which I approach this, because in every other retelling of this story, it's always Detterding who gets the horse and Samuel who gets the mule, and that just had to be changed. So before Detterding and Samuel, they're going toe-to-toe, and so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to show this battle, but turn the story inside out. I wanted to give a fresh take on one of what I think is one of the greatest rivalries of the last century. So as I'm going along, I get a lot of questions now when I'm talking about Breaking Rockefeller, and I'm a big believer that, and I'm a history buff. I love history. I'm an analyst, and I love mixing historical context into our own contemporary problem sets. And I'm a big believer that history's all well and good, but if you can't learn from it, then what's the point? And so what I wanted to do in the final part of this story, as we see how the transition from coal to oil unfolded, how the world switched fuel sources, which I think offers a lot of insight into where we are today, as I argue in the book, that I believe we're switching from an oil-based economy to natural gas, at least when it comes to transportation and electrical generation. I wanted to draw out those legacies. How do we learn from the past? How do we draw those legacies from the past and apply it today? So there's a few that I actually think are really pivotal. I mentioned one earlier, the invention of the modern oil tanker. Many of the innovations and design breakthroughs that were incorporated into Marcus Samuel's very first oil tanker were adopted and became the template for all early oil tankers in the 20th century to follow, and many of the innovations are still present today. So if you look at some of the massive super tankers that are rolling out of the shipyards in South Korea, you will see a steam cleaning device that actually sprays the inside of super tankers down in order to clean them, to prevent fumes from gathering, to prevent them from exploding. Yes, well, that first happened in Marcus's tanker. So you actually start to see how the world that we rely on today emerged through these flashes of inspiration and ingenuity that these upstarts were pushing forward. I also thought it was interesting that we see in this story, to break Rockefeller, the actual moment when the global market for oil emerged. Because up until around the 1890s, Standard Oil essentially set the price for oil. Rockefeller had grown so big and become so powerful that the price of oil, whatever Standard said the price was, that was the global price. That was the global benchmark, and no one could beat it. And what occurred, thanks to Samuel and Detterding, was that they began to push all of these colossal market forces onto the shoulders of Standard Oil. And it was at that point that Standard actually broke. Because what they did is essentially they made oil cheaper in the rest of the world than it was in America. Rockefeller was abusing his own consumers. He was artificially elevating the price of oil. And so by applying real market forces out of Asia, using Russian oil, Marcus and Detterding, and Sumatra as well from Detterding, they actually made the price of oil cheaper in the rest of the world. And this essentially set out a banquet for the starving in the United States, because it was only then a matter of time before some other ingenious guy put a lot of oil in a tanker and sailed it across the Atlantic to the United States and tried to sell his kerosene in Boston or Pittsburgh. This was something Standard could not have. An invasion of foreign oil into the United States was an unimaginable outcome. And so what happened was Standard caved, Rockefeller broke, and they essentially accepted the creation of a global market price. So today, when you turn on CNBC and you find out what the price of oil is, and it fluctuates, and it's actually based on market forces, and frankly, the price of Brent in Tokyo is the same as the price of Brent crude in Europe. That was a result of the first moment when the avalanche, or I should say the flood of crude began to crest over the dam that Rockefeller had established in creating Standard Oil.